All right, so this lecture is on anatomy and physiology. This is chapter 4, but we're only focusing on pages 116 through 129. We have an additional anatomy lecture further on in the course. When we talk about anatomy, we want to piece it down into the different parts of oral communication. So later on in the semester, we'll talk about the areas for articulation, phonation, resonation, respiration, and swallowing and hearing. Today, we're really going to focus on the areas for the central nervous system that kind of overarches everything, as well as cognition and language. That'll kind of guide us into the next couple of lectures. When we're talking about the nervous system, we're talking about the areas that control our speech and language systems, and that includes the respiration, the phonation, and articulatory systems. When we talk about the nervous system, you might kind of wonder, why do I need to know this as a speech pathologist or an audiologist? And it's really because it guides our clinical practice. If we know that a patient has an injury to a specific area in their brain, it can help guide what we expect with their language or speech outcomes. The same thing if we have damage to particular anatomical parts. So if someone is missing part of their tongue, we know that they're going to have specific trouble with either speaking or talking or swallowing. So when we talk about the parts of the nervous system, we have to piece it down into the smaller areas. So the first thing we'll talk about is the neurons, and those are the things that carry the information to and from each system. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of neurons, and it has 3 different types of nerves. It has the cranial, the spinal, and the autonomic. And then we have the central nervous system. So the nervous system is very complex and highly evolved. We're kind of pare it down for this class and keep it kind of simple, but it is good to know that there are lots of things that interact with each other in the anatomy of the brain to give us our output with our language and oral communication. Now, all of that needs help or stimulation from the environment. It's just like when we put our hand on the stove, we have that sensory response that says this is hot and the motor response to move our hand away from that hot eye. All of that's controlled by a two-way street within the central and the peripheral nervous system. So we have 2 different types of signals. We have the efferent, which are the motor signals. They carry information away from the brain to the cell body or to the organ. So that's that motor signal that tells us to move our hand. And then we have the afferent, and that's the sensory signal that's carried to the brain. That's that signal that told us that the stove was hot. And the peripheral nervous system gathers that information about the environment and sends the information demanding that action. The central nervous system is really what coordinates that information and integrates it to give the commands. So when we break that down into a little bit simpler terms, we can see that we have the stimulation from the environment. So that's our hot stove to our hand. It sends that sensory signal that it's hot. It goes that way through the peripheral nervous system up to the central nervous system, where the central nervous system interprets that information and tells it what to do. That's where we get our motor signal from that travels through the peripheral nervous system to the hand and gives us our motor signal and our response to remove the hand. Now again, all that information is carried by neurons. Neurons are just nerve cells that form the nerves to carry that information to and from the CNS and the PNS. All that information gets there because of the parts of the neuron. So the nucleus is the core of the cell body. It's what tells that neuron what its responsibility is. So neurons have different responsibilities, right? Because they can't all have the same job. We have to kind of piece it down to make sure that all of that information is traveled efficiently into the right area. So for instance, in the case of our hand to the hot stove, the nucleus for each neuron on that pathway has a job of getting that information not only to the brain but back to the hand and not to the foot. Okay, and then we have the axon. So the axon is the sender of that signal and the dendrite is the receiver. So essentially these neurons are attached to each other to create this neural pathway by the axons and the dendrites. Some of these neurons, axons, are covered by a myelin sheath, which is an insulator or pathway to carry information faster. Now, that's what gives us our white matter, but our brain cells or gray matter don't have this sheath. All of this information is carried through an action potential, so that's the electrical pulse that carries the information from one neuron to the next. If a neuron doesn't reach its action potential, then the sensory signal dies. It ends at that neuron because it can't excite the next neuron to get it to the next location. So again, we have those two different nerve types. We have our sensory or afferent signals, that's information to the brain, and then we have our efferent signals, that's information carried from the brain. And then we also have mixed nerves. So again, that talks about our nerve roles, right? So we have ones that have roles for sensory information, we have roles that carry information for motor, and we have others that carry information for both. We'll talk about those more when we talk about the cranial nerves. All right, so now we'll just focus on the peripheral nervous system. This is just a brief overview of the peripheral nervous system. We'll really dive into that in our next anatomy section. But we're going to focus on the area that gathers the information and demands for action. So the peripheral nervous system is a collection of nerves outside the skull and the spinal column. So it's a collection of three different types of nerves: the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the autonomic. So the cranial nerves enter or exit at the base of the skull, at different levels of the brainstem and the top portion of the spinal cord. They're the ones that give us the signals to move our mouth, for our hearing and balance, for sight, for smell, all of the areas related to about the area of the shoulders and up. There are 12 cranial nerve pairs. They all enter and exit here at the brain, and these are the white areas of the brain that you see. And when we kind of look at a cartoon image, it'll help you piece out those areas a little bit better. What I want you to know for this first test is really just that there are 12 nerve pairs. I'm not going to ask you specifically about which nerves there are until the next section. And then for the spinal nerves, those are attached to the spinal cord, and it's important to differentiate the spinal cord from the spinal column. And so, when we talk about the spine, we think of the bones, but it's also a structural support for the spinal cord. And so that spinal cord is where we have those sensory and motor nerves held, and they're what kind of control more of the lower areas of the body. So this is what controls our hands to move, our feet to walk, but it also controls breathing. Now, it's closely related to the autonomic nervous system, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and it has 31 nerve pairs, and they're divided among the spinal column, so the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Now, for the autonomic nervous system, that's what controls and regulates our internal environment. So again, we were talking mostly about sensory and motor signals for the cranial and spinal nerves, and now we're talking about what tells our internal environment what to do and controls that area. It doesn't directly control speech or language, but it can affect them. So if you think about when you're scared, it's hard to think of quite the right word to say. Or when you're presenting in front of someone, your breath kind of changes a little bit, and that's all related to the autonomic nervous system. There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and they work in opposing manners. So we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic is used to help the body cope in emergencies. So it's what speeds our heart rate, rises the blood pressure, dilates the pupils, increases that blood flow, and it's really kind of that fight or flight system. The parasympathetic is the one that helps calm the body back down to a relaxed state. So after we've gotten out of danger, it slows our heart rate down, it lowers our blood pressure, and increases the activity throughout the body and relaxes the body. Now, it's not specific to the environment that these systems work. It's not that the sympathetic system turns off and the autonomic or parasympathetic system turns on. They really work in coordination throughout the day. So when you're sitting here right now watching this lecture, your autonomic nervous system is working even though you're not in a fight or flight mode. All right, now we are going to focus on the central nervous system. It's the one that regulates, integrates, and formulates that information to give us our commands. So the central nervous system is made up of the spinal cord and the brain, and we're going to learn about the different parts of the brain because they're very important for language and cognition, as well as hearing and swallowing. So the spinal cord is this area here that travels down below the brain, and it contains bundles of nerves that transmit that information to and from the brain. It also holds the spinal nerves, okay? That's part of the peripheral nervous system. So it's that passage for information to the skeletal muscles and information from the sense organs through the spinal nerves. And then they branch out on either side of the vertebral column. The spinal column or spinal cord is attached to the brain stem or the lower portion of the brain, and then it's encased within the spine. Now, the brain has different parts, and it's our most important structure for speech, language, and hearing in all the higher activities. Now we have three major divisions. We have the cerebrum, which is that big portion of the brain that we really think of when someone says brain. And then we have the cerebellum. This is our little brain, or this small portion here under the brain. And then we have the brain stem. And the brain stem, again, is what houses those cranial nerves, but it's also important for communication of information from the brain to the spinal column. For the cerebrum or the brain, we have the cortex or the outer layer. Now the cerebrum is kind of wrinkled to accommodate more tissue, so that's why we have all of these different areas here, and they have names. So these kind of lumpy, bumpy parts are the gyrus or gyri, and then the sulcus or the valley. If we have a very deep valley, if you look here at the center of the brain, that's that very deep sulcus, it's called a fissure. And then the fissures help define our lobes, which are those well-defined pieces of the brain. So again, our areas are designated by fissures. So we have the longitudinal fissure, which goes down the center of the brain, and it divides the right and the left hemisphere. We have the central fissure that goes down from the middle to the kind of the top to the bottom, about halfway. It creates the frontal lobe. And then we have the lateral fissure, or the fissure of Sylvius, and that's that one that kind of goes horizontal here on the side of the brain, and it creates the temporal lobe. Again, we have two hemispheres, the left and the right, and 4 hemispheres per lobe, so 8 lobes total. So here's the longitudinal fissure, we have that central fissure, and then the lateral fissure here on the side. We have the right and left hemisphere. And then these are the different functions and structures that I really want you to focus on for this class. There are lots more structures and functions that you'll have to learn in your anatomy class, but just for this class I want you to focus on these kinds of functions. The important thing to remember about learning the anatomy of the brain is that once you know the function, you can interpret the dysfunction, because essentially the function is broken, creating the dysfunction. So if we look at the frontal lobe, it houses the motor cortex, which controls the muscles. Okay, it's the one that interprets that information from the sensory signal and says, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to lift your finger and then very gently tap it to click the mouse. It also houses Broca's area, which is our important motor speech center, and it's only typically found in the left hemisphere. So remember, we have lobes on each side, right? A frontal lobe on each side, each hemisphere of the brain, and Broca's area is typically found in the left, and it's complemented by Wernicke's area, which is also typically found in the left temporal lobe. So again, this is our motor speech center, and we also have the motor cortex, which controls the muscles, right? The motor signals for the rest of the body, not just related to speech. And so we know that that has to do with movement, because motor is movement. So we think about speech production, right? Moving our lips, lifting our tongue, clicking our teeth. And so if we have a problem with our motor function, we have a problem with speaking, right, or moving. Now, the frontal lobe is also responsible for cognition, and so we'll talk a little bit more about cognition later, but this is where we get our reasoning, our planning, our emotions, and our problem solving. So if someone has damage to the frontal lobe, they have a problem with cognition, then they're going to have problems with planning, with emotional control, with problem solving, or any other cognitive deficit. Now we have the parietal lobe houses the somatosensory cortex. So remember we talked about our motor and our sensory signals. So our frontal is really our motor, our parietal is really our sensory. So it's where that integrates that information for pain or touch, temperature, or pressure. So if that signal goes from our hand to our brain for that hot stove, this is the area that says this is hot, this is painful. We also have the angular gyrus, and this is what helps our reading, writing, and word finding. Now, if we're thinking about sensations and trouble integrating sensations, when we think about speech, language, and swallowing, it might be a little bit difficult to say, well, why does it matter? Why is it important? And it's really because of dysphagia. We have to have sensation of the oral structures or the mouth to be able to adequately swallow and sense when something's in our mouth and trigger our swallow. And so if someone has damage to the parietal lobe and they have trouble integrating body sensations, they can have trouble swallowing. If they have damage to the area of the angular gyrus, they can have trouble with reading, writing, and word finding. In the temporal lobe, it houses the primary auditory cortex. So this is what receives the sound stimuli from the acoustic nerve. So we have the acoustic nerve of the peripheral nervous system. It sends the information to the primary auditory cortex, and it's the area that tells you that this is a high pitch or a low pitch. It can also tell you if it's a loud sound or a quiet sound, and it also helps integrate what you're hearing, and it works with Wernicke's area, so that's understanding and formulating speech. So if I say dog, this is the area that tells you the meaning of dog, okay? And again, it's usually in the left hemisphere and works very closely with Broca's. The temporal lobe is also responsible for the perception and recognition of the auditory stimuli. It has a small memory component, and then it has a small speech component. Now, this is, again, once we know that function, we know the dysfunction. If someone has damage to Wernicke's area, then they're likely going to have Wernicke's aphasia, and that is a problem that we deal with as speech therapists. And finally, we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is really where we have the vision, okay? So it houses the visual cortex and processes that visual information. So we have sight. We can see that something is in front of us. We can see that it's a bright light. This is the area that gives us the meaning. And so it's important, obviously, for reading and writing. If someone has damage to the occipital lobe, they can have visual agnosia, which means that they can see, meaning that they're not blind. They have an image coming in through the eyes, but they can't comprehend what's in front of them. All right, and now we have the cerebellum. So we've moved on from the lobes or the cerebrum, right? And we're going to focus on the cerebellum. This is this small brain here at the bottom, and it's very important for movement. So it helps with equilibrium. It also helps with posture and coordinating and modifying fine motor movements. Now, when you think about speech, speech is a fine motor movement, which is why it's so important for speech. If we have damage to the cerebellum, we can have a type of dysarthria that gives us a very quick or slurred speech. It's also important for body posture, and body posture is important for feeding. So we have to have a good core stability to be able to have our safe pressure system in swallowing. And so if we have poor body posture or we're very weak in the core, then we can have trouble feeding. And this is typically more common with our kids. As far as the brainstem goes, this is this small area here, right? So this cerebrum has actually been divided in half so you can see the brainstem a little bit better. This is the area that integrates and coordinates information from the peripheral and central nervous system, and so each part of the brainstem plays a role in that communication. So we have three divisions. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, or the medulla. The midbrain is responsible for linking the higher and lower centers of the brain, so it's also known as the relay station. It's the one that says, okay, you're a signal that you need to go here to the visual cortex. You're a hearing or sound, you need to go to the auditory cortex. You're a motor signal, you need to go to the frontal lobe. We have the pons, and it bridges the two halves of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has to communicate with the cerebrum. So this is where parts of the cerebellum actually travel through the pons to provide information to the areas of the cerebrum. And then we have the medulla. This is the one that's responsible for breathing and other functions. It houses a lot of the cranial nerves related to breathing, and it also contains motor nerves that provide speech. So this chart's here just to help you piece out the areas that we just talked about. Here at the top we have the nervous system, but we have to remember that there are different parts of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and then divisions within those. We have the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, the autonomic nervous system that are part of the peripheral nervous system, and then we also have over here on the central nervous system the brain and the spinal cord and the different areas for those. All right, so you have an anatomy and physiology chart on Moodle. It is due on the 5th. This due date isn't correct. It's due on the 5th at 10 p.m. And we'll talk about it more in class tomorrow, and you can bring it with you and complete it while you're in class as well.